Welcome to the Final Ghost Podcast. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Ghost Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the Final Ghost Podcast, welcome. We're going to be spending the next few months talking about the most elegant of movie monsters, the vampire. In each episode, I'm joined by a special guest to dive deep into a vampire movie or two. And today, we're going to be looking at one of the most original and one of the earliest depictions of a vampire on screen, F.W. Murnau's 1922 bootleg, technically, adaptation of Dracula. I'm of course talking about Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror. And in the second part of the episode, we'll be going into Werner Herzog's reimagining of Murnau's film, Nosferatu the Vampyre, starring his tempestuous close collaborator Klaus Kinski as Count Dracula. Both of these adaptations of the vampire story present an equally distinctive and grotesque vision of the vampire. I'm joined in this episode by film critic and silent film specialist Pamela Hutchinson to discuss all things Nosferatu and dive into the different adaptations of the vampire tale by Murnau and Herzog. If you're new to the podcast, please know that we discuss the films in detail from pretty much the very beginning. Both of the Nosferatu films that we'll be discussing are essentially adaptations of the Dracula story with slight differences. But if you are averse to any discussion of a film that you haven't seen, consider this your spoiler warning. This season is made possible with the support of Our Video, who bring you the very best in cult, horror and genre films, specializing in deluxe definitive home entertainment editions with uncut versions, newly commissioned artwork, and specially curated extras. Their collection now spans more than 500 physical releases, and throughout the season, we'll be recommending a film that we love from their vast collection. This week, our pick is exploitation master Roger Corman's take on a classic tale by Edgar Allan Poe, The Fall of the House of Usher, starring horror icon Vincent Price. For more information, visit ourfilms.com, and I will link to it in the show notes as well. But for now, please enjoy our discussion about all things Nosferatu. Pamela, welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. It's been far too long since I was talking to you.
It really has, and it's completely unacceptable.
Well, I mean, I remember thinking when you said you were doing another series, I was like, oh, that would be the post-lockdown series. But yeah, lockdown's catching up with you.
Yeah, no, and also, frankly, what else am I going to do if I'm just stuck by myself in my house? Lockdown. I'm going to watch vampire movies and talk to people.
Exactly. You're never alone with vampires and your online friends.
Well, exactly. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about two versions of Nosferatu.
Yeah, Nosferatu 2. Something like that. It was funny in my head, is what I'm saying.
It's funny for me too, so please keep them coming. Because every time I've gotten an email from you, there was another vampire pun, and I couldn't rise to the occasion.
But you thanked them, right?
I did.
Yeah.
So
anyway,
let's kick off first by talking about Nosferatu, the Murnau film from 1922.
Right. So I find it hard to contain myself when I'm asked to talk about this film. I just think it's so incredibly beautiful.
This film is one of cinema's original vampire movies. And where does this sit in the history of horror cinema? And in cinema in general, really, I guess.
So there's, to your first question, there's a really annoying answer, which I'm sure, you've heard me say before, which is well, actually, horror is a post-silent film kind of genre. So, it's before horror. I mean, but that really ignores the actual fact of the matter, which is that it is relatively late in the very short cycle of pure German Expressionism. So German Expressionism, people know the the German films from the silent era with the tilted angles and the strange painted sets, and it all kicked off with Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And we can see the influence of that style throughout German cinema of the 1920s, and we can see it go obviously with the emigres into Hollywood and film noir. Very pure German expressionism, didn't last very long at all, and Nosferatu is kind of the tail end of that. So there is already this rush of horror films, scary horror films, that weren't called horror films at all, that it's sort of jumping on the end of. So it's both pre-horror and actually quite late in this particular run of classic proto-horror, maybe we could call it.
Yeah, I was about to say, if it's not strictly a horror film, what would you call it? Or what was it, kind of, how was it built at the time?
I mean, it's a romance, right? I mean, it's a very beautiful pastoral romance that just happens to have a terrifying monster from the undead. I mean, really, I think that, genre wasn't really a big thing in the way people talked about selling movies at that time. And people would have known exactly where they were with this film because they'd have seen that it was historical, that it was pastoral, that it was romantic, that it had a supernatural element. They'd have seen things, like the golem and so on, that were beginning to draw on mythology and superstition in this way.
So this was also infamous because it's loosely based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, but they couldn't clear the rights, or they couldn't obtain the rights to adapt it. So it's sort of an unofficial adaptation of the novel. How do you think it sort of draws from the Stoker's novel and adapts it into this cinematic language?
So, I mean, loosely adapted is like a really polite way to put it. Basically, It's adapted. They changed the names and hardly anything else. I mean, they wanted to adapt the novel and they, as you say, they couldn't get the rights. And this is a problem, as we're probably going to talk about, that they got sued by Bram Stoker's widow. But it is basically Dracula. I have to say that because I think that, the Dracula story from Bram Stoker's novel is very specific and has all this, well, it's a real horror story, isn't it? Because it's about estate agents, right? I say that with love and hoping that my house move goes through. But, it's a very specific story, a very specific set of characters and scenarios and places. And it really clearly maps onto that. It does come from a sort of visual idea as well. So the producer of this film was this quite mysterious character, the producer and the production designer. His name was Albin Grau, and he said that when he was a soldier in the First World War, he met a chap who said that his father had, died but been reborn, entered the undead, and he'd been buried in a certain ceremony. And Albin Grau was very interested in the occult, is pretty much what we know about him. So very susceptible to this kind of story. Possibly, I don't know enough, possibly the kind of person who would concoct such a story. But that was what, the visual idea of that was what started the film. And then they went to Bram Stoker, and then, so Henrik Galeen wrote the screenplay, and Murnau rewrote a little bit of it, but basically it's all based on those two ideas, this visual idea of someone joining the undead and the incredibly famous, successful and brilliant novel, which would be a great thing to make a film of.
And what do you make of the way that the vampire or the undead Count Orlok is depicted in this film?
I mean, he's really, really strange looking. I mean, to me, there's two aspects to the way he looks. The sort of hollow eyes and the extended ears and nose and those strange teeth, which just look like they're ready to be weapons. Is unlike the kind of vampire that we see in later horror films where you almost have someone seductive and handsome. It looks like you could meet him at a dinner party until he flashes his fangs. But also with Nosferatu, it's the way that he moves. Whether he's springing up on his heels from the coffin or whether he's sort of gliding. It's terrifying. He's completely uncanny. He looks almost like he could be a human person, but entirely like he must not be.
Yes, you're so right. It's the fact that he doesn't look human. Just similar enough to pass as human, but something quite weird about it. Even the way that he lifts things up, or the way that he walks, the way that he moves around all these coffins and all these things, it's so off-putting because he's quite small in size as well. So just seeing him lift all of these presumably really heavy objects just becomes really unsettling as well, because what do you make of the way that the violence, the blood feeding, the stalking, is portrayed in the film?
I mean, it seems very strange to us now because it's almost touchless, basically. It's just these shadows that fall over people. I think it's, one of the greatest things that have happened in film history, basically, the way they use the shadows in this film. The shadows stand in for so much more. And it's interesting that whenever we think about German Expressionism and we think about film noir coming off that, we sort of talk about shadows. Oh, maybe they represent, sort of amount of moral murkiness, a darkness, and an unknown that's within the frame, it's within the story. But here, they genuinely just feel like someone's shadow could actually harm you, and that's quite a terrifying idea. And you see it again in a film like Murnau's Faust, where you have the sort of shadow of death fall over an entire town, and that's what this is. Literally, it's the shadow of death, and it fulfills all kinds of metaphors that are readily sort of subsumed into the Dracula story, and particularly into this version of it about the pandemic and the war and so on. We're not expecting gore here at all, but the way they do it is very cleverly gives you something that almost feels like that touch.
And I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned, kind of how it stands in for bigger fears, or especially kind of around that time. And one of the notable changes from the novel is shifting all the action from the Count trying to move to London to him trying to buy a property in the town of Wisburg. I think, hope I'm not mispronouncing that. And the hysteria and the death and the kind of the griminess that his mere presence brings to the town and kind of takes over the town, and the hysteria that arises from that. How do you think Nosferatu was kind of, and Murnau were playing on the anxieties of the German public at the time?
I think there's no other way to read this film, and other than, there are many aspects you could add to it, but you can't talk about this film and the story they're trying to tell without thinking about that idea that, to live in Germany at that time, to have had, obviously so many lives lost to the war. And when you think about the way that the sailors disappear on the ship, it's sort of like symbolic of that. But, the state that the country was left in after the First World War, and, it was very depleted, and the economy obviously was in a terrible way. And then, of course, the flu pandemic, and so many lives lost to something invisible. And obviously it's something that very much we can all appreciate a little bit more now than in other years, sadly. But these things are terrifying, and it's very specifically to do with what's happening in Germany and in Europe, so you can see why they keep it on the continent.
You mentioned kind of a little bit briefly before, but how within the work of Murnau, and there's quite a few of his films that have been lost since, but how does this sit within his filmmaking and his particular interests?
It's absolutely the film that sort of broke him through, despite sort of limitations on distribution. It is his sort of early great achievement of his visual poetics. It's one of his most beautiful films, despite being one of the earliest and low budget films. The amount of artistry that he gets into this film is really quite stunning. And if you've seen obviously the Hollywood films like The Sunrise or City Girl, or if you've seen Faust particularly, you can see exactly the same stunning visual imagination. It's also got a lot of resonations with a lot of his films are about these kind of like temptation and scenarios, and these seducers. Obviously like Faust, obviously like Sunrise with the a vamp rather than a vampire, taking over someone's life and being a malign influence on them. And so you can see sort of thematically and artistically, it's exactly, where he's going with his work. Sadly, he died so young. We didn't get to see much more of his work. He died sort of just around the time that the sound era was coming in, having completed Taboo. But, who knows what would have happened if he could have lived to see Herzog's work.
I can't wait to get into that one after we're done with this first Nosferatu. But you alluded to it a little bit before, because the film was an adaptation of Dracula, but without having cleared the rights. So and the producers were sued by Bram Stoker's widow, and the film was almost disappeared from history because it was ordered to be, all copies I think were ordered to be destroyed. So what was kind of the story behind this lawsuit and the film's thankful survival?
I mean, basically, she sued quite rightly, I understand, because if you let this one stand, then obviously you're not going to have a leg to stand on to pursue any other similar claims. So you'd constantly have people ripping off your husband's work, but and they didn't have a case really against it at all. There's changes to the story, but I would argue not enough. So the idea was exactly that, as you say, that they ordered all the prints to be destroyed, which sounds like quite a successful idea, but it's very hard to contain the number of prints that are out there in the world. And so what you had for years with Nosferatu is it wasn't a lost film. There were prints in archives, like Iris Barry had one in MoMA, I think, and there was one in the Cinémathèque Française, but it wasn't widely available. And some of these prints, were missing intertitles or often slightly different versions. And then there was a re-edited sound version that came out in the 30s. And so what it becomes is the perfect thing for horror fans actually is the cult film, the little scene film, this film where everyone's seen certain stills. There might have been a few screenings. Obviously, that situation is completely reversed now. It's been restored several times, and it's in many. You can buy it on Blu-ray and DVD, and I'm sure you can rent it online for a few quid. So now it's completely available. But there was this point where it was this kind of sort of shadowy object for a while, but it was never entirely lost.
I love the idea that you call it a shadowy object. So what was its kind of cult status? And especially kind of, this is a double-pronged question really. Kind of, what was it like when it was that shadowy, kind of almost forbidden film? And where can you see its influence on other films?
If I had a list for you of where you could see the influence of Nosferatu on other films, this would become an incredibly boring podcast. It's everywhere. You could, ring a bell when you're watching any kind of spooky horror film or even just a thriller. The particular favourite example being the shot of Orlok ascending the stairs where you see just his shadow. It's endlessly copied, and you can get some of these looks from a still or a clip, from an image of a face. And so people who haven't seen Nosferatu think they've seen Nosferatu. People who haven't seen Nosferatu have seen quite a lot of Nosferatu. I mean, it sort of has a value beyond a film. A lot of people, I know horror fans, hate the idea of people saying it's more than a horror film. I honestly think Nosferatu is just more than a film. It's an idea. It's a kind of visual world all of its own.
Oh my God, could you expand on that? How do you think it's more than a film?
I think that there is an idea of what Nosferatu is and the way that it uses light and shadows and the figure that it created that sort of goes beyond simply the people who have seen this, 90-minute version of an audio-visual loop. You know what I mean? It's got more cultural value than that. And I think that's because it's created by a great director, it's beautifully made, because it is based off this incredibly powerful story. There's everything that went into it and the timing of the film. I feel that people have an idea of what expressionism is. They sort of go to Nosferatu. And also the great thing about the way that Nosferatu plays with shadows and darkness and anything you might call horror or expressionism is it takes all those tropes that you could see on
so let's start by discussing
sort of set-based films
Murnau's
like Caligari and takes them outside into the real world. So suddenly you have this quite terrifying idea that shadows and horror can happen in daylight, on the open water and things like that, and in people's private homes. And it's really I think it expands. I don't think anybody can have not seen an image that is, inspired by Nosferatu at this point. It's almost like the idea of Father Christmas or fairies or something. It just goes beyond, one source. That's my opinion. I know it sounds quite
I love it.
Extravagant, but yeah, exactly. I think genuinely this is something that fits into the imagination, and I think we can talk about that more when we talk about the Herzog. But yeah, it goes beyond just a film that some people have seen, and I think that's partly to do with its sort of strange distribution history as well as everything else. But it's just a great work.
I love this idea of a film that becomes so much a part of the visual imagination of popular culture that it transcends the actual film itself. It's almost so murky and diluted by just how far it's reached. And before we move on to Herzog's version of the Vampyre, you've talked a lot about kind of its influence, and even people who may have not seen Murnau's Nosferatu will kind of recognize images of it, recognize the image of Count Orlok. But would you recommend that contemporary horror fans seek it out if they haven't seen it yet?
I mean, I'd recommend everyone sees it. I'd recommend that, your mother's dog watches it, right away. But, I think it's a really interesting question to say, would contemporary horror fans like it? If you are, if you consider yourself a horror fan and you define horror as those films that scare you, those films that terrify you, you might find it quite frustrating because it spends a lot of the film not trying to horrify you. And then when it does, it more unsettles you than horrifies you. There's no thrill in this film. On the other hand, I think you'd be frustrated if you went your whole life watching all the films that had taken a little bit here and there from it in respectful ways. I'm not suggesting anything else, and not seen the original. And I just think, if you love cinema, you should watch this film. As you know, Anna, I always consider myself someone who doesn't really like horror, apart from all the horror films I watch and love. And so I think, well, of course, if I love it, then anyone will. But it's one of those films, I know people rail against ideas of canons. No one should say you must watch anything, but I believe that people will get a lot from this film. It might take a little patience if you're not used to watching silent films at first, but it's well worth it.
And a slightly more specific add-on to that question. You mentioned before there are multiple versions of this film now, restorations, different variations with different soundtracks. Which particular version would you recommend people seek out?
I mean, I think the most recent restoration that I've seen is so beautiful because it combines all the tints that we saw in the original, and you really have to sort of know, and I'm sure you do, again, without going too forward, I mean, Herzog uses colour in a really interesting way. In Nosferatu, the colour tints are used for some practical purposes to tell you what kind of time of day it is, but also they really add to the beauty and that kind of sweetly pretty aspect of the film. As far as scores go, I mean, there have been so many, and what I really would recommend everyone to do, and I know that it's a bit bittersweet to do this, anytime you can just see it with a live score is the best thing, because with this film, I really don't want anyone to press pause. I don't want anyone to get distracted. I want you to have the full Nosferatu experience and be spellbound by it. Lock yourself in the cinema with a live band when you can and watch it being played live, because there's so much about the acting in this film that's actually quite musical. I'm always intrigued to see what musicians do with it.
And well, hopefully we'll be able to do that sometime soon.
Soon, I hope, yes.
So let's move on now to the Werner Herzog's 1979 reimagining of Nosferatu, the Vampyre.
The ship seems burdened with a curse. One sailor and our cook have disappeared without a trace.
Nosferatu, the Vampire, coming from 20th Century Fox. Nosferatu, the Vampire, a film unlike any Dracula film ever made. Nosferatu, the Vampire.
Okay, so I know so much less about this film. So this film, I mean, it's one of those films I think technically, okay, it came out just before I was born, right? But still, just not my period. But,
Well, like a challenge.
One of the things I find is really interesting about this film is when I was talking about the influence of Nosferatu, the 1922 version, as someone who talks about silent film on the internet quite a lot, people often have a complete cross-identification between these two films. They will share pictures of Klaus Kinski and say, I love silent film. The sort of cross-identification between this film and the original is really strong in the public imagination, I think. And I find that really strange because we always talk about remakes in terms of, is it better or is it worse? And we're always ready for it to be worse. This film seems to almost have just continued the love for Nosferatu. I mean, it does many other interesting things as well, but it feels like a continuation of that work in some way. People will watch Nosferatu 1922 because they love the 1979 version.
Which I guess is kind of a real compliment to pay for the film, because Herzog is a really massive fan of the Murnau film and of Murnau in particular. And I think he called it the greatest film to come out of Germany, period, not just the greatest horror or vampire film. So what are your overall thoughts on his interpretation of the vampire story?
Well, obviously, first of all, I have to say that clearly Werner Herzog doesn't like it as much as I did, because he calls it a film and I've said it's more than a film, so he's not really that big a fan.
If this tiny podcast becomes a sort of call-out challenge on your part, Pamela, to Werner Herzog to have a Nosferatu off, can I please record it, because I would like that to be documented for posterity.
Oh, obviously, that was just a flippant joke on my part, but it does amuse me because obviously one of the many great things about the great filmmaker Werner Herzog is he does express himself with such strength and enthusiasm. The idea that I would say, oh, I think you've toned it down a bit there is quite hilarious. So, yes, I share Werner Herzog's high opinion of the Murnau film. I think what he does here is really beautiful, and I had seen it years ago, but I rewatched it for this podcast, and I had slightly misremembered some things. And one of the things I love what he does is he really finds a way to find images that talk to the original images in Nosferatu. Instead of doing what billions of people have done and just recast those same images with slightly different actors. So many shots from Nosferatu get repeated and copied and plagiarised and homaged and everything like that. But he finds other ways to use shadows and light and to sort of continue the same aesthetic, which I just, watching it again, in the dark days of lockdown on my little home projector, I just appreciated it all the more.
So can you elaborate on that? Kind of how do you think that he continues and places his Nosferatu the Vampire in conversation with Murnau's Nosferatu?
I mean, so the obvious thing to do is that, he is talking to Nosferatu. We were having lots of conversations about this at home before we watched it because my partner Googled it and it said, Google says it's just Dracula. And I'm like, it's not Dracula. It's Nosferatu. And you can tell it's Nosferatu because of the way that the Count looks, and you can tell because of the period setting of the film, and they went back to similar locations. They couldn't get quite the same town. It's Delft, isn't it? But I just like the fact that we have other scenes of shadows being used in clever ways. I know that the rats were not very well treated, but, the focus on the rats, we have the same scene of the coffins being loaded but shot from a different angle. You're constantly being reminded of the old film, and not necessarily in a bad way. We've all seen the trailer for the Black Narcissus series where they restage the bell ringing shot and you just think, well, that's clearly just not as good as the original. Whereas I felt that I constantly was being reminded of the previous film in a way that made me run them both in my head at the same time. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And when I was rewatching it last night, I'd also seen it a long time ago and rewatched it last night for the purposes of this. And I was really struck by kind of how it blends three things. It blends Herzog and his own interest in making a vampire film. And then it blends, obviously, the influence of Murnau's Nosferatu. But then it also blends Dracula because it does kind of replicate the story from the book a little more closely than Murnau's does. And the character of Count Orlok is not called Count Orlok. He's called Dracula in the film, which on paper, and it's funny that you mentioned your partner Googling it, it does kind of become confusing because the film is Nosferatu. It's an homage in many ways to Murnau's one, but then it's also much more straightforward because of legal reasons adaptation of the Dracula novel. Let's talk about kind of the vampiric element of it first. And what do you make of the way that he updates and presents Nosferatu, let's call him that for the purposes of clarity, and Klaus Kinski's performance.
Well, Klaus Kinski's performance, I think, is really interesting because if you see like a Gwir, Wrath of God, and, you know, what I know of his work, you know, he was a large performer. And this is quite...
That's a very generous way of putting it.
I appreciate that kind of acting. Obviously, I watch a lot of silent films, so I'm into it. But, you know, it's very restrained here. I read this anecdote that said that that he would let him have a tantrum on set, so he'd be exhausted by the time he came to... And I think that's so patronising, but possibly true. I have no idea how these things work. But, you know, it's very restrained. And it's almost like he's confined, you know, in this odd way, which is really powerful because it's open and light, this film, and yet people are very constrained in their movements and where they go. Obviously, the shocking element, if you've come from 1922, fresh off the boat from 1922, like I did, is sort of hear the noise of blood sucking. And obviously it's suddenly a little bit more physical.
It is a lot more physical, isn't it? It's almost, not to jump too far ahead, but there is kind of almost sexual overtones to it, especially in the way that he approaches Lucy's character. You mentioned kind of a little bit before the way that Herzog uses color in the film. What do you make of the visuals of the film?
Well, I mean, I love the use of colour, the sort of white house at the beginning, and the way that certain people's faces, Isabella Gianni and Klaus Kinski's faces, are always washed out. So you instantly know the connection between them is going to be there. There's this intensity to her performance, which is really wonderful, and a lot of it is to do with the way that she is dressed and made up, as well as, you know, her acting. I thought, how do you do a film that is obviously in black and white and so has been remembered in this slightly misremembered way sometimes? I think people remember Nosferatu as being more black and more white, if you know what I mean. They don't see the shades of grey in the mise-en-scène of that film. And he's really replicated the look of the film. I honestly felt like it was somehow, I was transported into the world of this black and white film that I'd seen before. Really, really enjoyed that. And yet I had a few things, as you say, the sexuality of Orlok, Dracula, Nosferatu, whatever his name is, and the physicality of the bloodletting sort of amped up, the volume turned up on them in all ways, and it really sort of hits you quite hard. It's not a gory film by most standards. There may have been a comment in my house about, well, that wasn't scary, which I never believe anyone when they say a film didn't scare them. But, you know...
Did you find it... Did you find that this version of Dracula, Orlok, Nosferatu is as unsettling as the Murnau version?
Personally, I didn't find it, and I expected to. I expected to be more scared, especially I did the whole turning off all the lights and all that kind of thing. I expected to be more scared because sometimes people often talk to me about film and they say, obviously things are scarier now because they're more explicit, or obviously films are more exciting now because they have this and that and the other. And it's interesting that I could see exactly how you could have made it a scarier film. You know, you could see how it could have been more explicit in those ways, but it's completely dialed down. When you think of other on-screen Draculas, it appears to be sort of willfully refusing you all the kind of sex appeal and all the gore and all the histrionics that we associate with those things. And, you know, we all love the Dracula vibe and, you know, Francis Ford Coppola and so on. But you take away all those pleasures and give us just the pleasures of the sort of pastoral original. And, I mean, I have no idea how he thought it was going to be a hit in 1979. But I mean, it just works so beautifully. I was actually quite floored by it.
I mean, I'm not even going to try to understand Werner Herzog's mind. It is unique, and I love that. I love him for it. But yeah. I did find it really interesting. I wonder what your thoughts are on the way that it presents the figure of the vampire, because as you mentioned, kind of the Draculas that we've seen on screen, that the sort of the idea of the vampire is presented as quite an appealing one, because he's a monster, but he's a monster only when he wants to be. You know, other than that, usually vampires are presented as quite human looking, able to meld, and actually quite appealing. You know, the idea of just a human being who can live forever in exchange for this grotesque kind of need to feed on human blood. But in this version, it's very much presented almost as a kind of disease, as an affliction, as opposed to a supernatural power. What did you make of the way that vampirism really is presented in this version?
Well, it's quite interesting that he brings out very much the idea of vampirism as a disease, as you say, which sort of begins in Nosferatu, or particularly in the context of Nosferatu, the original. What's wonderful, I really think, about this film, what it does add to the original is a certain amount of humanity within its lead characters. It gives them a little bit more, more brain power, and in the case of Dracula, it gives him a lot more humanity. Klaus Kinski looks at the camera with those eyes, and you see a sort of tortured soul. Whereas, with Orlok, I love that film, but he is presented almost as he could be made of papier-mâché in some ways. He's a terrifying figure. Whereas Klaus Kinski takes you into the idea of what would it mean, to live alone for so long. The sort of the real horror story of the vampire. I recently watched for another reason, I really recently watched Near Dark, which I'm sure you'll be talking about in this podcast. Yeah. And similarly, really thinking about that idea of whether you do or don't really want to be a vampire, and the idea that it could be medically cured as well. That was quite a good double bill I did on successive Saturday nights, actually, but it wasn't on purpose. I was incredibly moved by Kinski's Dracula.
When I was watching it, I was sort of cynically thinking, well, that's a very over-the-top dramatic thing to say, time is an abyss, and all of these like beautiful monologues that he has. But there is an obsession or an interest more like in the concept of time and how time is experienced by Nosferatu as an eternal creature. What do you think kind of Herzog is trying to explore through with the idea of time?
I'm sure he has lots on his mind. I loved all his rather poetic and grandiose speeches, because I think that that's what Orlok was trying to say. Really, you see all the sort of texts in the original film. I think that, sometimes we understand the horror of something through our own desires. And obviously that's a theme that comes out in horror lots of the time. Maybe you're drawn to the vampire. That's the obvious one, isn't it? But we're all scared of, or most of us are scared of mortality, and especially in times of, illness or war, that particularly comes to the forefront. But then it's like, what if you got what you wished? What if you got to never die? If you had the gift of immortality, how would that time prey on your mind? And of course it becomes another horror. It's that kind of thing where, we hate the fact that we don't know what other people are thinking, but of course if we really knew, we'd be tortured by all this extra knowledge, and it's constantly the idea that the vampire has this sort of gift of youth, as it were, but actually it's a torment. And I think it does become the idea of time, because we all know that, if you've had a restless night, half an hour can seem like a long, long time. So the idea of living for eternity is something that actually, well, I think the idea is that that you would be driven insane. And, Dracula is insane.
Let's move on kind of to Lucy, who I think is portrayed by Isabella Gianni in this version. And I think kind of having seen them back to back in the last couple of days is given a lot more agency in this film, I think. So first of all, kind of what do you make of the Count's obsession with her from the very first sight of her in the photograph?
It's hard to sort of think about it without thinking about, the long distant memory of reading the novel and being told that there's these ideas. There always is this love story element, isn't there, between Dracula. I have no idea what any of these characters are called at this point. Between Dracula and Lucy. Like there is between Dracula and the young man, who I now have, yes, Harker in this case, sorry.
Yes.
And I think one of the disturbing thing that more campy Dracula films really play on is the idea that, the vampire is always obviously bisexual, and so you might think that he might be after one person, but he might be destroying a relationship in a completely different dimension together, and he's obviously disturbing all our sort of heteronormative ideas about this, that this young estate agent and his fiancée would have. The connection between them is clearly much deeper than that, though, in this film. There's a sort of suggestion that she's already there, isn't there? I think, I don't know, because, you always have these crosscuts in any Dracula film, but here I think it runs a lot deeper. And as I say, a lot of that is to do with the way that she talks and the way that she looks. I mean, she's kind of vampire ready.
Yeah, she is, which is interesting because actually the connection between her and Harker seems to be much stronger though in this version. Like even they're kind of almost, don't know, mental connection in the way that she reacts to him being in danger seems much more intensely devoted to Harker than she is to Dracula, but their connection just seems much more, I don't know, physical, visceral, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many ways in which you could argue that in the original film, you know, him having this partner, she's there because she has this function to play in the film. It's the depiction of the relationship between the two is depicted as innocent and part of that sort of world that's under threat. Whereas I think in the 1979 film, we sort of take their bond and we really explore how it gets tested by the arrival of Dracula, etc. And also, you know, people have dialogue and you immediately give them a little bit more interior space, I think, which is, you know, true and correct. I'm not being sarcastic about sound film, not today.
And let's talk about that scene between Dracula, Orlok, Nosferatu. This is very confusing.
The kind of guy with the teeth.
The guy with the teeth, the bald guy with the teeth. Let's talk about him and his scene with Lucy at the very end, which is the downfall of pointy teeth guy. And like I alluded to before, has a much more overtly sexual vibe to it than the original Nosferatu, and I thought I was reading too much into it. But then when I was reading up a couple of bits before we started recording, Isabella Janning has also gone on record saying that she very specifically played it in that way.
I mean, I suppose it's strange because obviously it's quite a strange and sick idea that two, you know, healthy people should not have any idea about. But it's somehow much more satisfying for us to understand that she desires to do this than she's a sacrifice.
Yes.
And of course, you know, this is why it sort of brings it on. And I think that, you know, I think people do have trouble with the Lucy character and Mina as well. In the Dracula myth, it's almost like a problem. What do we do with the Victorian heroine who isn't really a heroine anyway? You know, so the Victorian supporting character it's not necessarily great for us. So yeah, I mean, it's quite disturbing, that final scene. I think it's a solution to a problem, and obviously for some people, I'm sure it's quite a sexy solution to a problem. I find it, obviously, personally a bit creepy. But, you know, it's a vampire film. It's meant to be. You know, it doesn't feel like the sort of, you know, often we see that kind of scene and it's kind of the glorious rebirth of the young woman as some, you know, she's going to become a vampire. And that's not really what this is about. It's more about getting us to the point that we know we have to get to, but getting us there in a way that we believe more. I think that's what my reading of it was. More that it's more believable, but I don't know. I maybe have to sit with that one for a while.
And I wanted to ask you kind of like your thoughts about the ending of this film, because in the Murnau film, kind of everyone, well, dies, but but in this one, kind of after Lucy you know, kills Dracula, Nosferatu, the tooth guy. She kills the tooth guy. She sacrifices herself, but kind of, you know, with a lot more purpose. And I even read it kind of as her manipulating and making sure that she gets the job done in that situation. But Harker comes back as a vampire himself and exhibiting the very same kind of physical traits, the very pointy teeth, the super pale skin, all of this, and he sort of smiles at the end. So the curse of Dracula is prolonged, which is a departure from the Murnau version. What did you make of this twist in the ending?
I mean, it's a great ending, isn't it? It's absolutely great. I mean, you've got a film about contagion, you've got a myth about contagion, a novel about contagion, and to end with it having neatly been wrapped up. I hate to say that in, you know, winter 2020, but the idea that the contagion will end one day quickly is a comforting myth for children, isn't it? That's not how contagion works, sadly. So yeah, I mean, I actually found it quite interesting, because then of course you set yourself on this circle of thinking, well, he sort of they go off on the horse, don't they? And you think, well, where's he going to go? And is he going to live in isolation? And would we next see him looking as grotesque as Dracula, that's his name, or will we next see him as the incarnation of a vampire that we see in so many other films, a sort of dapper, too seductive gentleman? It's interesting to me. I thought, I thought it was a much better ending for 1979, shall we say.
It's also interesting because it kind of takes away the quote unquote specialness of Dracula. The fact that he, by the sheer fact that there's someone else who inherits his traits or has the same traits as he does, kind of makes him just a vampire as opposed to the vampire, if that makes sense. He's no longer kind of this icon because he can be replaced and replicated, and he's not that special.
I mean, that's one way to take Dracula down a peg or two. I mean, obviously, the idea of a vampire who stays in a castle is much safer. I mean, one of the terrifying whole things about Dracula is the fact that he plans to come and invade another town, and the amount of death and devastation that he wreaks en route is actually, every time I watch a version of this film, of this story, I should read the novel more often. I get shocked again by how many people die. That's the whole point of it. It's an absolute plague, and he is a plague, and that's why it's interesting to me to have been just recently watching Near Dark, because you definitely get that sense that there's lots of them out there.
And to bring both of these films together, really, it's interesting you mentioned kind of the idea of the plague and of him being a symbol of contagion, really. And one of the things that I'd completely forgotten really about both of these adaptations is how much time is devoted to the townsfolk and how they talk about Nosferatu and the vampire, how they talk about all the superstitions, this idea of the Harker character picking up a book and learning from a book kind of all the superstitions around this undead creature. What do you think both of these films kind of deal with the idea of superstition, of lore, and how that creates that myth of the vampire?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. I think, one of the things is, it's always, just a really potent horror idea that when you've read about it, and of course, it isn't true, and then we turn around and prove that it really is true, and there's an axe maniac outside your house. The idea that the urban legend becomes true is what you get in all the 1980s and 90s films, isn't it? But here we're going back to the folk legends. I mean, there's such a wealth of material out there that could be hit upon. I suppose it's interesting because it works on both those two levels. You're thinking about the idea of all the mythology coming to life, but you're also working on the basis that it is a little bit like a real plague. It is a bit like a real thing. I mean, we spent all year reading about symptoms and, death statistics and how you can or can't catch something, and of course we all know that as much as we read about these things, it offers a very little protection. Just because there's a werewolf in the forest doesn't mean it won't get you. Oh God, I didn't really mean to say something so grim, but it's true.
It is true.
We do live with the knowledge of a lot of danger in the world, and we all have to take risks when we go out and about. We don't think about this in relation to the undead, obviously, but we're aware of crime, and we're aware of disease, and we're aware of dangerous tides and all these kind of things. And just to add another level to that, I think it's interesting. Our own personal perception of risk is what this film kind of plays on a lot, or this story kind of plays on a lot. It's a very interesting question, though.
And just to wrap up, what is your own personal favourite on-screen Dracula adaptation?
Okay, I'm not allowed to say Sesame Street, am I?
No, you can. Of course you can.
Do you know what? The film that I really, really love that has stayed with me, and I think is probably quite predictable choices, but it's The Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night.
Oh, nice.
That film absolutely floored me when I saw it, and I love it, and I just watched it again recently, and yeah, I mean, but though just even thinking about this and thinking about what the choices might be, and I've been working on a few vampire things elsewhere, I just feel like there aren't too many bad vampires. Vampires are great.
Vampires are amazing. Even the bad ones are amazing. I mean, when you said there are no bad vampires, I started thinking about Dracula 2000. And I was like,
Okay. Do you know what the thing about the sort of bad vampire is that it goes quite quickly into the camp vampire. We've had two very uncamp vampires here, but, you know, we can all enjoy a campy vampire sometimes.
This is true. The vampire is probably one of those monsters that works even when he doesn't work.
Yes. That may well be true. That may well be true because it's got a certain glamour apart from in these two films.
Yeah.
These are the outliers. I mean, I don't ever want to say the U word about anyone, but some people would say that they're othered in their appearance, animalistic in their appearance, and some people wouldn't consider that as foxy as a man with his hair slicked back and a nice suit on. But they're wrong, obviously. We love our beautiful bat-eared vampires.
Yes, of course we do. Especially with their very enviable nail games. Very great nails.
Well, exactly. I mean, you know what it's like to kind of maintain that kind of point.
I mean,
It's
it takes a
hard.
lot of work. I
It does.
can't do that.
I certainly can't. Not when I'm sitting around worrying about risks in daily life all the time and biting my nails.
Pamela, thank you so much for your time and for your insight. And where can people find out more of your work online? And specifically all the vampire stuff that you're doing.
Ooh, vampires may take a moment to come good and to appear in a vampire form. But honestly, I shout about anything that I'm doing on my Twitter account, which is just @PamHutch. So you can see what I'm up to there.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Final Ghost Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. If you can, please do take the time to leave us a review or at least a rating on Apple Podcasts. It does really help a lot. You can find out more about what we do on thefinalghost.co.uk and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Final Ghost UK. You can also follow Pamela on Twitter at PumHutch, and I am at Anna B. Demented. Thank you for listening, and next week we're going to be diving deep into some 70s vampire action.